We are training the next generation to meet the strategic challenges of tomorrow. We are dedicated to understanding in order to act better.
Bonjour tout le monde. Good afternoon. My name is Guy St-Jacques. Let me just introduce myself briefly. I spent 13 years altogether in China, first in Hong Kong from 1982 to 1984. And then I had 3 postings in Beijing at 3 different periods. The first from 84 to 87 when China was still very much a poor country. I went back in 95 and was there from 95 to 99. Couldn't believe on arrival that China changed so much in 8 years. And finally, I went back as ambassador of Canada in 2012, and I was there for 4 years. And of course, during those years, I had to deal about Taiwan issues with the Chinese government, and we can come back to this later. So I would like to thank the organizers of the conference for inviting me to chair this panel. As an introduction, I would like to speak briefly about Xi Jinping and then about Canada's position and history with Taiwan. In my view, Taiwan could become a flashpoint, especially as we know that President Xi Jinping sees the return of Taiwan as an important part of his legacy. And the wording used by Chinese leaders on the reunification has changed in recent years to implicitly warn that military action is no longer excluded. And this has increased risk in the region. And the focus put by the Chinese regime on nationalism has also exacerbated the rhetoric and the enthusiasm of the Chinese public for the return of Taiwan. And this makes the search for a compromise more difficult. In terms of Canada, when Canada recognized the People's Republic of China in 1970, the then Foreign Minister, Mr. Sharp, came up with the formula that Canada took note of China's position on Taiwan without approving it. And that leaves, in my view, place for creative ambiguity for the Canadian position. I would also like to note that back in 1966, the previous foreign minister, Paul Martin Sr., had promoted the idea at the UN that both the PRC and Taiwan be members of the organization. The Americans were not favorable, and in any case, the start of the Cultural Revolution in China resulted in the postponement of a decision on China's adhesion. If both had been in the UN, it would have been not much different than having East and West Germany or North and South Korea that were members of the UN. So this, introduced an interesting perspective. Over the years, China has become a lot more forceful in considering Taiwan as one of its red lines, and therefore it has succeeded in forcing other countries to reduce official contacts with Taiwan. The last Canadian minister to visit Taiwan was John Manley in the 90s when he was Minister of Industry. As we have learned a lot more in recent years on China's aggressive way to conduct international diplomacy and its propensity to use bullying tactics such as hostage taking or using trade as a weapon when a country does not obey its diktats, and Canada and Australia are good recent examples of this. We have to think about ways to better protect our values and democracy around the world, including in Taiwan. Also, we should not exclude the possibility that to ensure his re-election to a third term as Secretary General of the CCP, especially if the economic situation of China is not good, that she might be tempted to order the invasion of Taiwan to rally public support. And I know that this is not shared by experts. I was at a conference by Brookings last week where experts said that this was unlikely, but I would say we should not exclude this. And so today we have the chance to have 3 great experts, Derek Grossman, Sana Hashmi, and Ting-Sheng Lin. to discuss all these issues. I won't repeat their biographies because you will have, I'm sure you had the chance to see them. Let me just say that they come with broad experience, have published extensively on today's subject, and we will be able to get the perspective from the Pacific Island, from another very important country in the region, India, and also to hear the perspective from Taiwan itself. And so we are in for a treat. We will start with Derek Grossman. Mr. Grossman.
All right, well, thanks for having me. So what I wanted to do today, since we've already talked about key U.S. allies in the previous panel, those being Australia, South Korea, and Japan, I was asked, and I would like to comment on U.S. partners and their responses to a Taiwan crisis or conflict. And part of the problem in this is determining which partners to talk about, because there's a lot of countries left over in the Indo-Pacific. So that was a challenge. And what I decided to do, and you guys can all critique me on this if you don't like the approach, but I decided to pick 3 different cases and talk about them. They are large, medium, and small size countries, and they are cross-cutting regionally in South Asia, Southeast Asia, and Oceania. And the 3 countries I wanted to discuss are India, Singapore, and New Zealand. In the Q&A, we can certainly talk about other U.S. partners as well, specifically in Oceania, which I find very interesting. We've already discussed to some extent. But in examining these partners closely that I mentioned, again, India, Singapore, and New Zealand, my top line takeaway is that their response to either a crisis or conflict scenario in the Taiwan Strait will vary depending on whether China or Taiwan precipitated the conflict. Much will also depend on the international response at the time, as manifested primarily by United Nations proceedings. And it'll also depend on their perception of the benefits and costs of getting involved. So with these thoughts in mind, allow me to briefly run through my thinking on each of these nations. So starting with India, and I know that we're going to talk more about India later in this panel, so I won't dwell on it too much, but New Delhi's longstanding non-aligned policy to ensure its strategic autonomy suggests that it'll remain on the sidelines no matter the situation in the Taiwan Strait. And look no further than India's current position at the United Nations on the Russia-Ukraine conflict, where New Delhi has repeatedly abstained on resolutions condemning Moscow and its refusal to adopt Western-led sanctions. However, great power aggression in the Indo-Pacific is probably very different for India. Since May 2020, India has been facing off against China at their disputed land border, and bilateral relations have tanked as a result. And India's partnership with the US is indisputably, in my view, the best it has ever been. There are lots of examples. There's lots of reasons and examples for why, but just one is that India in November 2017 decided to rejoin the Quad with Australia, Japan, and the United States. And the unspoken mission, as we've talked about in earlier panels of the Quad, is to counter Chinese designs on the Indo-Pacific. I mean, for a country that is non-aligned, right, to now be involved in essentially aligning with like-minded democratic partners in a multilateral format is a pretty big deal. And with that context in mind, Chinese military aggression against Taiwan would likely cut both ways for New Delhi. All right, so on the one hand, India, again, as a like-minded democratic partner of the US, has attempted to take a stand against authoritarian aggression. That would suggest India would strongly condemn a Chinese invasion of Taiwan, once again, keeping in mind that aggression within its neighborhood, the Indo-Pacific, is much different than a world away in Eastern Europe. But on the other hand, India would be highly reluctant to unnecessarily antagonize China by undermining or terminating its recognition of the One China principle. By doing so, it could make the disputed land border worse. It could give China extra reasons to support India's arch nemesis, Pakistan. And it could also even potentially drive a wedge between India and Russia, as China and Russia's relationship has dramatically improved in the last few years. India also values international consensus making as an integral part of maintaining a rules-based order. So my thought is India might be open to sanctioning China, especially if others take the lead, but overall, India would probably resist American requests and Canadian and Australian requests, Japanese requests, for additional assistance in punishing or countering Beijing in the Taiwan scenario. Turning to Singapore, so, again, I'm trying to pick examples within each of the subregions of the Indo-Pacific. So from South Asia, now moving to Southeast Asia, I've always referred to Singapore as America's de facto ally, even though we don't have a formalized security alliance with them. Washington's partnership with Singapore, particularly in the security domain, runs really deep. Look no further than U.S. forces having sustained access to Singapore's Changi Naval Base. Singapore certainly has concerns about China's rising economic and military power and has decided to keep the U.S. close by. But Singapore, like India, has also decided to tread cautiously when countering Beijing. And so we've seen the Chinese make inroads through security agreements with Singapore as well. It's not just the U.S. having that relationship. It's notable that unlike India or any other country that recognizes the one China principle for that matter, at least as far as I know, Singapore conducts military exercises with Taiwan. The engagement started out as top secret in 1975, and they were known as Project Starlight, when then Taiwanese leader Chiang Ching-kuo signed an agreement with Singapore's Lee Kuan Yew. In recent years, a relationship was revealed, but the activity hasn't stopped, other than for a brief time during COVID. My understanding is that Singapore, because of its uniquely limited geography, seeks out opportunities to train with partners to perfect its craft, and Taiwan has been an ideal partner in that regard. On one of my many trips to Taiwan, I visited Kaohsiung, and my interlocutor there described with pride how Taiwanese and Singaporean troops would vigorously compete by racing up a local mountain. The relationship is clearly long-standing and filled with mutual respect. With that said, Singapore's position is likely to be similar to India's if China were to attack Taiwan. And that is, one of cautious, and that position is one of cautious support for the US as well as its allies and partners. A key difference, however, is that Singapore will face far more pressure to enable US military operations because of pre-existing agreements, such as the one providing access to Changi. Much is likely to depend on the level of threat Singapore itself perceives from China's actions against Taiwan. And given the close relationship with Taiwan over the decades, I wouldn't be surprised if Singapore feels quite alarmed and becomes supportive of US and ally and partner efforts. Also, to some extent, Singapore will be guided by the regional, in other words, the Asean response, as well as the international response. Singapore prides itself on being a pillar of maintaining the rules-based liberal international order. Overall, my general sense is Singapore will be more supportive than India, but still less supportive than the US hopes it will be in a Taiwan conflict or crisis scenario. And then switching finally to New Zealand, we actually have a recent statement on the matter regarding Taiwan. Just this week, when Prime Minister Ardern visited the White House, the joint statement contained the following line, quote, "We underscore the importance of peace and stability across the Taiwan Strait and encourage the peaceful resolution of cross-strait issues," end quote. I don't think that this is, and somebody can correct me if I'm wrong, I don't think this is the first time Wellington has ever expressed concern over China's recent bad behavior vis-a-vis Taiwan. But it certainly was a timely expression, considering that Beijing continues to fly military aircraft into Taiwan's air defense identification zone, with the largest incursion of 30 PLA aircraft since January happening this week, earlier this week. New Zealand is clearly increasingly concerned over China's actions, even as Wellington has attempted to decouple its political from economic interactions with Beijing. And also, as kind of a side note, going back to Cleo's presentation earlier today, the Chinese Foreign Ministry a day and a half ago now totally went ballistic on New Zealand's joint statement with the US, specifically on the portion that talked about how the US and New Zealand were both concerned about an outside power that they do not have shared values with playing a role in Oceania. So that's, and that, by the way, I believe is the first time that New Zealand has ever said that. That's a really big deal because New Zealand, as well as Australia, of course, view Oceania as their sphere of influence, or to be, kind of negative about it, their backyard, right? Anyway, so over the last decade plus, New Zealand has held itself up as a model of how a Western country can maintain productive ties to China in spite of serious differences, right? For example, in 2008, the two sides signed a free trade agreement. But China's assertive behavior against not only Taiwan, but also against Hong Kong and the South China Sea, and its domestic repression of Uyghurs in Xinjiang have all given New Zealand pause. And New Zealand brought up all of this in the joint statement earlier in the week. It's also important to note that while the US and New Zealand are no longer formal treaty allies, the partnership remains extremely close through the Five Eyes intelligence sharing arrangement, as well as the Australia, New Zealand, United States, or ANZUS multilateral treaty agreement. Ongoing strategic dynamics, namely the bottoming out of Australia-China relations and the strengthening of the US-Australia alliance, are likely to eventually have an impact on New Zealand. As part of ANZUS, for example, New Zealand could be obligated to support Australia and the US if either or both are attacked by China during a Taiwan contingency. Thus, my sense is New Zealand, for all of its attempts to try to silo off economic from political interactions when dealing with Beijing, all of that would probably come crashing down if good friends Australia and America came calling. That said, Wellington might still exercise some level of caution in precisely what it offers Canberra and Washington to prevent becoming a target of Beijing's ire itself. This would be an extraordinarily difficult balancing act to pull off. India and Singapore are much better positioned to pull it off, actually, because they do not have this, ANZUS agreement. So that covers India, Singapore, and New Zealand. But again, there are many other US partners that we could discuss. For instance, I've also considered, as part of this presentation, though in the interest of time, not going to talk about it, we could talk about it in the Q&A, Taiwan's 4 remaining diplomatic partners that they have in Oceania, and those are Marshall Islands, Nauru, Palau, and Tuvalu. And the United States happens to have very good relations with most or all of those countries. And as pointed out earlier, specifically with Palau and Marshall Islands, they have compacts of free association, or COFAs, which are unique international agreements that enable the US to have exclusive military access to those countries' territories and their surrounding EEZs. And so that's a really big deal. And again, they are 2 countries out of 4 that still maintain diplomatic ties with Taiwan over mainland China. So their responses in a potential crisis or conflict could be very different, wildly different than what you would expect among the rest of the Pacific Island nations that recognize China over Taiwan. And so I'm going to conclude here. And before I do, let me just say that the vast majority of partners that are left over in the Indo-Pacific are probably going to have an easy time essentially telling the US, we don't want to get involved, because they kind of fit the India or Singapore model. Very few will face the same level of pressure as New Zealand, again, because of its unique situation. And so, I would argue, and I don't think this is particularly controversial, that the US should not really count on having many partners helping it in a Taiwan crisis or conflict scenario. The problem is when I, have these types of conversations with folks, in the US government, but elsewhere as well, there's kind of this sense that, there are going to be a number of partners who step up. It's just, once they see China cross the strait and start to invade Taiwan, everything's magically going to change. And I don't really see much evidence of that. In fact, the partners that I've spoken to, that I've read about, that I've, otherwise, kind of consumed information about, they say the exact opposite pretty much in every case. I mean, even in the last panel, South Korea, ally of the United States, it's very unclear what level of support South Korea would provide to the US, even though they're allies. All right, so even in an alliance situation, there's not much that you can really expect or should expect. And partners, I think, are even a level or a few levels below that. So I'll stop there, and I look forward to your questions and comments. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Now let's turn to Mrs. Hashmi.
Thank you, Chair. And I would like to extend my gratitude to Professor Messi for inviting me. I'm delighted to be a part of this panel. And I'm more delighted to be out of Taiwan after 2.5 years and to discuss this topic, which we generally don't discuss in Taiwan. And why am I saying this? It's a very important topic. It's very important to discuss if China is going to invade Taiwan. But when we discuss things in Taiwan, we generally tend to discuss Taiwan's bilateral relationship. I'm not saying that this topic is not discussed in Taiwan. This is primarily discussed in Ministry of Defense and INDSR. That is a think tank that is funded by Ministry of Defense. But when we talk about other think tanks, when we talk about strategic community in Taiwan, the topic that is being discussed primarily is Taiwan's bilateral relationship, Taiwan-US relationship, Taiwan's positive role in the Indo-Pacific. So these are the main topics that are being discussed. So what are the main reasons behind that? First, of course, in Taiwan, there was this realization that the war is not likely to happen. Of course, Russia's invasion of Ukraine has somewhat changed this perception. And now there is a rethink about how China is going to respond to Taiwan question. But apart from that, there have been attempts to come out of the China shadow. And there's also this realization that there is more to Taiwan than the cross-strait relationship and the so-called Taiwan factor in the US-China relationship. And this is one of the reasons why we see conferences on Taiwan's bilateral relationship with Japan, with US. In fact, if you look at the think tanks that work in Mandarin, you would realize that a number of conferences actually take place on Japan. Like what Professor Steve mentioned about how favorable Japan is towards Taiwan and how unfavorable Japanese are towards China. These two things are not really correlated, but I think this is something that we also need to pay attention to. Now, what I'm going to focus on is, of course, India-Taiwan. That's one of my primary areas of research. When we talk about India-Taiwan relation, I believe that for a very long time, it didn't really get its due. And it wasn't really discussed in the larger foreign policy debates. But now this is changing. We see that a lot of scholars in different countries are talking about India-Taiwan individually, as well as India-Taiwan relationship. So this particular set of relationship has gained salience in the Indo-Pacific, and there is no doubt about that. But before I go ahead and talk about how the policy of India has changed towards Taiwan and vice versa, I would like to establish this fact that India still adheres to the one China policy. Having said that, I would like to, I think I disagree with Derek when he talked about one China policy and how India perceives Taiwan. Even though India adheres to one China policy, India has never recognized Taiwan as a part of China. And in fact, since 2010, India has stopped mentioning one China policy in the official statements. It was the last time in 2008 that the one China policy was mentioned in the joint statement. And in fact, in 2014, then Foreign Minister of India, she asked Wang Yi, she suggested that India is only going to accept one China policy when China respects and accepts one India policy. Having said that, there's no doubt that in principle, India still follows the one China policy. In fact, the last time when the one China policy was mentioned by an Indian official was in 2018 by the Foreign Secretary of India. And that was actually in reference to Taiwan. Even though he mentioned one China policy, he didn't really say that India recognizes Taiwan as a part of China. So why did he mention one China policy in 2018? It was because the Parliamentary Committee on Foreign Affairs, it came up with the report. This was specifically after the Doklam standoff in 2017. In 2018, the report came out and there was a suggestion that India should recognize Taiwan. that was a huge thing. Parliamentary Committee on External Affairs suggesting that Indian government should have diplomatic ties with Taiwan. But at that point of time, this report, this suggestion didn't really get a lot of attention. Why? Because the relation didn't really attract a lot of attention. But there has been a lot of changes when we talk about India-Taiwan relations. Now the relations have undergone tremendous changes. Both sides are trying to engage each other meaningfully. And in fact, it's not a recent development. Since the coming of BPP in power in Taiwan, we are seeing that Taiwan has been trying to reach out to India, specifically through the new southbound policy, which was introduced in 2016, and of which India is a priority country. But before that, this particular set of relationship didn't really attract a lot of attention. And I would say that both countries are at fault. And in fact, I call this relationship, if I have to really describe India-Taiwan relationship before 2016, I would say that's a classic example of missed opportunities. From Taiwan side, KMT didn't really have this inclination to advance ties with India. The focus was more on managing tensions with China, having conciliatory approach towards China. In fact, in early 2010s, there was this motivation, there was keenness from India's side to negotiate an FTA. And in fact, India also commissioned a feasibility study to have an FTA between India and Taiwan. But at that point of time, Ma Ying-jeou wasn't really keen on having an FTA with Taiwan, despite the fact, with India, despite the fact that Taiwan had an FTA with Singapore and New Zealand, because it was seen as provocative towards China. So in fact, the Ministry of Economic Affairs at that point of time said that this is not the right time to negotiate an FTA with India. So I think this was one of the most important development that happened when India was keen on advancing ties with Taiwan, but Taiwan wasn't very keen. But now later, towards the end of the 2010s, India actually put the relation with Taiwan on the back burner. After the Doklam standoff, China wasn't really expecting this kind of firm response from India. And China extended an olive branch to India. And then we saw that the two informal summits took place. And we saw that there was this kind of personalized touch to diplomacy between India and China. The leadership in India realized that they could achieve a breakthrough if they go ahead and have these informal summits and have talks with China. And this was one of the reasons why the developments in India-Taiwan relations were put on the back burner. And since then, what we have seen that, of course, there have been positive development. There is a lot of engagement at the civil society level, but the relationship hasn't really taken off at the government level. But when we talk about the civil society, we have seen specifically since the 2020, the pandemic and how Taiwan handled the pandemic and the Galwan Valley clashes, this relationship has attracted a lot of attention. And contrary to the popular perception, I would say that China wasn't really the primary reason behind that. And of course, being in Taiwan, specifically by locals, I've heard this dictum a lot of times that enemy is a friend. But I don't think that really was the reason behind this growing bonhomie between India and Taiwan. Of course, this change, I won't really deny this fact. The change is definitely guided by the common concerns, and that is definitely China. But there were several other major reasons as well. I would say that China was a contributory factor, but there were other factors as well that were responsible for this growing bonhomie between India and Taiwan. One is that Taiwan's profile has been rising at the international level. DPP government Tsai Ing-wen refused to accept the 1992 consensus, and after that, how Taiwan has been trying to engage several countries in the region. And this has also led to rise in Taiwan's stature profile at the international level. Then apart from that, there has been growing awareness about Taiwan and India. And I would say that China has been a reason. At the same time, China decided to escalate tensions with just India and Taiwan. China has a lot of active territorial disputes, South China Sea, East China Sea. But the reason that China went ahead and escalated tensions with India and Taiwan at the same time, it kind of resonated with the people of both India and Taiwan. Then apart from that, COVID-19 pandemic and how Taiwan handled the COVID-19 pandemic really contributed to this growing awareness about Taiwan and India. I think what really made Indians curious about Taiwan, that where is this country that's handling COVID-19 so well, that most of the countries are under lockdown, but this is one country that's actually leading a normal life, that actually led to a lot of awareness about Taiwan and India. And in fact, that's mostly reported in the local media. That's not really reported in the international media because that wasn't really something that was considered important. But that played a very important role when we talk about India-Taiwan relations, the changing nature of the India-Taiwan relations. And apart from that, how the Indo-Pacific construct is emerging and the rebirth of Quad played an important role in Taiwan's thinking of perception of India. Then when Modi came to power, there was this expectation that he's going to be firm on China, and at the same time, he's going to be more proactive towards Taiwan. And this was primarily because he had past affiliations with Taiwan. In 1999, he visited Taiwan as the General Secretary of BJP. Then later in 2011, he invited a huge business delegation to his state when he was the Chief Minister of Gujarat. And during the visit, he actually said that Taiwan and Gujarat are natural partners. Of course, here, Indian states have more autonomy and freedom to engage, deal with Taiwan. And I feel that this is where there's a lot of potential to engage Taiwan when it comes to Indian state, when it comes to attracting Taiwanese investment, where India is really interested in. But when it comes to China, Modi has been firm on China. Look at India's response to Doklam standoff and even the Galwan Valley clashes. Modi administration, even though it has been trying to manage tensions with China, at the same time, it has been firm. You look at Jaishankar's statement on China. In the recent past, he is one of the foreign ministers who has been vocal on China, who is not really mincing words on China. So this is also one of the unprecedented things when we talk about India-China relationship. Now, from Taiwan's perspective as well, India is also gaining a lot of salience in Taiwan foreign policy, Taiwan's regional policy. India's growing profile in the Indo-Pacific is an important reason here. Apart from that, what is more important here is India's robust ties with both US and Japan. Given the unique nature of US-Taiwan relation and the tremendous support Taiwan has been getting from Japan, I believe it's only natural that how India is being perceived as like-minded country for Taiwan. And in the same breath, I would also say that Taiwan wants to include the strategic component in its relationship with India. That's not happening, but this is also one of the expectations from India-Taiwan relationship. And also when we talk about Japan-Taiwan relationship and Japan-India relationship, Japan's words have been backed by actions. Japan is the only country that's actually talking to Taiwan at the government level. Of course, we can't really talk about US-Taiwan relationship. That's a relationship that's unique in nature. It's totally different from Taiwan's relations with Japan and India. LDP has party-to-party talk that's semi-government level, but at least Japan is talking about, Professor Stephen already talked about how Japan has been more proactive towards Taiwan. So I feel if I have to really say that who's the true partner for both Taiwan and India, I would say it has to be Japan. Then for Taiwan, the NSP, the new southbound policy, was introduced in 2016 because it wanted to diversify its foreign relations. It wanted to reduce its overdependence on Taiwan. And India has been an important partner since then for Taiwan. And this was also because China has been considered as an existential threat for both Taiwan as well as India. And for Taiwan specifically, by having robust ties with India, it's a way of dealing with China and kind of creating a shield against China. It's a part of greater scheme of things, but India plays an important role in that context. But for India, I think the approach is totally different here. To deal with China threat, Taiwan isn't really an option here for India. So if we see an effort from India's side to reach out to Taiwan, it isn't really guided by India's own problem with China. In fact, India is not using, and is not even going to use Taiwan as a pawn in its relationship with China. So even today, despite all these developments, we see there is a shift in India's policy on Taiwan, but despite that, India has been cautious on Taiwan. India hasn't really talked about it openly. And I think the reason why Taiwan is not mentioned in the Quad statement is India. So of course that is there, but I'm going to be positive about this thing. I think this is primarily because India doesn't really view Taiwan through the prism of China. And it's not really guided by what if China invades Taiwan. But if I'm saying this, I'm not really saying that it doesn't really impact India. Taiwan under China's control is going to impact India's security. But I think if I have to say that, if I have to really talk about India's response when and if China invades Taiwan, I would say that if we talk about India's position right now and how India's relationship with China and the US and other like-minded countries are, I would say that India is not going to intervene, but it's an important development. And I think there is a rethink in India's policy towards Taiwan, but I would still say India is not going to intervene if at all China invades Taiwan. And I feel that it's natural because much of the focus of India is on a strengthening economic ties and commercial ties. And I believe that if Taiwan really has to get something out of India, it has to raise the stakes with India, and it has to focus on commercial ties. And the commercial relations are only going to lead to more security and strategic component in the relationship. And I'm not saying that, to conclude, I would say that it's not that India is not going to play any role if at all China invades Taiwan. India is slowly thinking about its Taiwan policy, and it's also because any change in India's Taiwan policy is going to be irreversible. India is going to be very slow with this Taiwan policy, but I feel that it's slowly going there. And I think here, the onus actually lies on the partners of both Taiwan and India, such as the US, Japan, and I think so is the case with Australia. Australia and India are somewhat on the same path when it comes to Taiwan. And I think, but most of the time, India is singled out and not countries such as Australia. So I believe that countries such as US and Japan really have to motivate India and really think about creating deterrence against Taiwan. And I think in the scheme of things, India is really going to play an important role. And in fact, as I mentioned, that Taiwan under China's control is not in India's interest, and is going to be detrimental for India's maritime security. And even if you look at the recent developments and India's initiative in the recent past, Professor John talked about the Andaman and Nicobar, how India has been trying to convert it into a maritime hub. India has taken a lot of initiatives in the maritime domain, such as Sagar, even the latest Quad, MDA. And India has been really taking initiatives such as IONAS, IORA, dialogues at several levels. India has issued maritime statements with Malaysia and Indonesia. India has been thinking about the importance of Taiwan in the maritime domain. And so I believe that if India has interest, India can play an important role, but it's the duty of and responsibility of the like-minded countries to really motivate India, where India could play an important role and really think about Taiwan in the region, in the Indo-Pacific region. Thank you.
Thank you, Mrs. Hashmi. And now I would turn to Mr. Lin.
Thank you for the organizer for inviting me to this conference. And I would like to today to present the panel about how the partner will handling the Taiwan question. And my question will be how Taiwan will handling his own questions. Because when we see the, sorry, we didn't get in. Okay, this is the official paper of the Indo-Pacific strategy. So take a look at what US means for partner. Taiwan is there. It's very, very rare that Taiwan become this kind of official presentation as a partner. Normally, we don't want to mention Taiwan at all. So Taiwan will become partner. So I think when Justin told me that, okay, we will, I will participate in this panel, they said, okay, if we talk about the war in the war over Taiwan, then about the partner, then Taiwan will be the double, that will play the double role. So I think that will be an interesting presentation. So I will present today about how Taiwan will react to the invasion. And that will depend on what will be the war plan of China side. That's always this interaction between the two sides in the conflict. So let's just go very quickly about this comparison. I won't add any comment, because if I add the comment, then that will very, very long my presentation. So this is about the comparison of the defense budget. Then we will see how small Taiwan is and how big China is. It's about 14 times. And then this picture shows how the size, the capacity of the Chinese military and Taiwan and all the other allies or US presence in the Asia. And this is the overall distribution of US force in the world. We can see the importance of Asia. The Indo-Pacific region is represented very, very important area in the distribution of the US forces. And this picture is come from the Japan, the defense of Japan, the newest one. So we have the reference of about Japan. So it's about the modern submarines, China side 52, and the other is Japan. And the other one is the modern destroyer and the frigate 71, and the yellow one is Japan. And then is the fifth generation, fourth or fifth generation flight, China and Japan. They didn't show Taiwan because Taiwan will not stand alone when there is a conflict. So when China think about the invasion of Taiwan, automatically the war with Japan is included. There is no way that Japan can say, okay, I will stand aside. No. Unfortunately, there will be no this kind of chance. And so we will think about this all together. And this is a comparison between Taiwan and Japan, China and Taiwan. So it's not a very interesting picture that we can say, oh, Taiwan will stand for 1 year, 2 years. If 1 week, 2 weeks, Taiwan is still there, it's pretty good things already. The picture says everything. And this is the breakout of all these equipment, very important for the calculate for Taiwan, for the planification, how long we can stand, okay? And this is a missile. So how can we say that Taiwan, the Taiwan Strait already into the war situation, or we still in the coercion period? It's very hard to distinct. If we just shoot the missile, okay, there's no invasion. Taiwan will stand or will just surrender. That's depends on that. So if we say that Japan or South Korea can just keep a little bit time outside the war theater and look at what happened, is only when we only use the missile. And the missile will be maybe determinative for the US engagement, and then Japan will get in. So that's the range of the missile. So Taiwan is even in the smallest one. And the Taiwan was included, and all the US present in the region was be covered by these missiles. And then we come back to the real plan of China's invasion of Taiwan. So China didn't make a real separation about the defensive plan, war plan, and offensive war plan. Both things is integrated. And for the political point of view, invade Taiwan is part of defensive act. There is no difference. And why Taiwan will become independent is because there is intervention from the outside power. So it's logic. So it's logic to not separate that. So we will see Taiwan. We will see when we study the eventual Taiwan invasion of Taiwan by China. We just have to see their white paper, the defense white paper, how they say, how they organize or how they planified their A2AD strategy. That will be enough. So what is A2AD? It's anti-access and aerial denial. So logically or theoretically, when we say that A2AD is, first of all, we will have to have the anti-access. If anti-access failed, then we will apply the aerial denial. But in the China case, in the Taiwan scenario, it's opposite, because American force is already present in the theater of war. So there's no way that we can try first anti-access, and then when it doesn't work, and we go back to do the aerial denial. No, we only can do is first start from the aerial denial, and then when we prepare the invasion, we apply the anti-access to delay or halt the U.S. force from reinforce the reinforcement from U.S. mainland or Hawaii. So that's the things that we have to separate this. So that's the definition of these two things. And then we will see all the how we say that, all the card or the element that we have to calculate. It's in this card. What's the range of the fighter? What's the range of the missile? And what's the range of the submarine can reach? And where we have to stop US Navy is all there. But it's quite simple when we see the card. Okay, it's here, we will stop them. And then we will have to prepare another kind of measure to stop people. But let me quote the Clausewitz, everything in war is simple, but the simplest things is difficult. So that's the problem. We know how to stop them, and we know where we have to deploy our equipment, but it's always very difficult. And we cannot imagine or just calculate according to what have to do, because in war, everything will change. So let's say we will have to figure out, or we will have to resolve two problems. First, dealing with US Air Force, air or naval force permanently stationed on the territory of Japan. There is, including the 7th Fleet, 5th Air Force, and the 3rd Marine Expeditionary Force, and in Korea, the 7th Air Force. And second, and how to slow down and halt American reinforcement, and leaving Guam, Hawaii, and the Middle East, or the continental US. So the order is opposite. We have to do first the aerial denial, find the enemy, destroy it, and then continue the other plan, go to the next step. So next step will be anti-access. Normally we have to do the anti-access first, but in the Taiwan case, in the Taiwan invasion of Taiwan case, we have no choice. We have to do opposite. So that's the specialty of the invasion of Taiwan. We will have to deal with the things differently. So let's go first with the aerial denial. And the aerial denial here, we can subsequently with both things, the quickly destroying Taiwan's capacity, and if much smaller, the Navy and Air Force. And second, deal with the permanent station, American force and the naval force located in Japan, Hong Island, and or Okinawa. Then China have the choice. They have to make choice. Do we need to do that? If we want to destroy the US force in Japan or in Korea, which means we attacked those enemy force in our neighbor's territory. So that means we provoke another enemy. They might stand outside, like Yun has said that, okay, Korea may be not so intended to engage in this conflict, but when you attack them, then you make them have no choice. But can we do that? Then we will see the pictures. There is no much choice that we will have to attack that. Otherwise, there will be no chance for the invasion. So that's just the first step. Then we see when in the anti-access Taiwan campaign, what we can do and what will happen. First of all, the theater will be the Philippine Sea. There's such a place that the anti-access, we won't want the American army to get in. So that will be the Philippine Sea. Then we will stop US force there. Then the scenario is the unprovoked PRC attack on Taiwan. And then we was, when John said, there is, if Taiwanese doesn't do the stupid things to provoke China, but the stupid things in the in Chinese definition, there's a lot of, it's a big range. They said, if you just delay the negotiation with us, it's considered kind of provoked. We won't see that provoke, which means the US or Japan will not see that as a provoke. So China thinks that is the way that Taiwan is going to independent, but our side, we don't think that's a legitimate reason to start a war. And then there is a difference between the different reconsideration about the situation. And Taiwan get into the war with China, and Japan and US have to get in because it's not a provoked. They didn't declare independence, but they just said, we don't want to talk to them. Just like right now, Tsai Ing-wen, as a president, she refused to talk to China, talk to Beijing for already 5 years, 6 years. And that will be considered as kind of delay forever the negotiation with China. So all these situations will go into the worst scenario, which means they will have the war between Taiwan and China. And this invasion will involve Japan at the first place, and the US Army will have to send their force from mainland China, from continental, American continental. And Korea will get in or not, we are not sure. But it is for sure, Japan will be there. And that's the place that Taiwan have to think about as a partner of this partnership, Indo-Pacific strategy, what we can do to defend ourselves. We don't need the US send a troop to defend Taiwan, but how can we defend ourselves? And there is a place what we can do, like Taiwan relation with Japan. And there is a very good example. Taiwan is developing their own submarine. But the best submarine, the conventional submarine is made in Japan. So that's the place that Japan can involve in the self-defense of Taiwan. They don't need to send troops. Taiwan can do that. Taiwan can do that themselves, but not right now. We have to extend the military service to 2 years to 3 years, especially for the Navy or Air Force. But Taiwan can defend themselves. But the question is, who can help them? Who can help them with equipment, like we send the equipment to UQAM, and then we said, okay, we cannot send something that can fire to Russia territory. You give them a rock just next to the border, then they go to Russia, right? So everything is between defensive and offensive. The question is, you want to give them or not? And Taiwan asked for that. And we had just before the Ukrainian war, Taiwan has ordered 140 or maybe less than that M109 artillery, and they have been canceled because US think that's not necessary for you. If China want to attack you, you buy the artillery, doesn't make sense. But that's our calculation because we are defending ourselves. We don't need you to tell me how to do that. But they really used to do that because they are always there. And they, during this scenario, during the invasion or just the deterrence or just anti-access, US is always there. So there is no way to separate, is Taiwan doing the stupid things or is a competition between the great power? There's no difference. And China do the A2AD strategy is not only for invade Taiwan, it's for this great power competition. And that's where we will bring us out is actually to go to outside of the Taiwan to see what's the relation between the invasion of Taiwan, which means East China Sea and South China Sea. They are both things complementary for China, but it's all necessary for China in this competition. It's a great power competition. If China wants to be the number one, which means their natural choice, and nobody here will say China don't want to be the number one. They just want to be the number two and number three forever. No, I don't think no one here will say that. So if China want to replace US, they have to be, first of all, the regional power. And if you want to be the regional power, you need Taiwan and you need South China Sea. You want to get Taiwan, you have to guarantee that no one will give you a flank attack from South China Sea, and you want to protect your South China Sea, Taiwan have to be on your hand. So it's two things together. You get two together, or you just have nothing, right? And then we will see why these 2 years, all this intrusion come from this side. Not Diaoyutai, that's very important, and that's the best place to make Japan angry. But we just leave that relatively quiet or calm, and we do something more important here. And they said, oh, that's because here is a lot of oceans, so we can do this. No, there's something calculated. There is something behind that. So that's the signal, very clear. Taiwan will be our objective, our objective, and South China Sea will be together to see that. And now we will see let's get a more clear image why Taiwan is important. Why Taiwan is important for China's great power status. Look at the color of ocean. We don't have to see where is Taiwan or where is China and the relation between them. We see the ocean. Just at the east coast of Taiwan, the ocean go deep to 1,000, 2,000 kilometers. And that's the place where the submarine can get out. Don't need to be worried about somebody can detect us. And that's the best naval base that we can use to guarantee our second strike. Now we have only the Hainan. It's not really ideal because you see the water is not very, very deep. So it's the place that we can still watch them, and we still know when their SSBN is coming out and go inside. When you get Taiwan, there's no way that we can know, or how many submarine is coming out and go back. No way. So get Taiwan is very important. And Taiwan is a hub between the Northeast Asia and the Southeast Asia, which means went all the way to Indian Asia. And Taiwan is the hub. So we get Taiwan, we cut all of this in half by half. We cut all this sea line of communication. And if, by contrast, Taiwan is still on the hand of the foreign forces, including Taiwan independentist parties, then it's China's sea line of communication will be cut. So that's why it's so important. And then we will see why it is so important, South China Sea. We have seen all these years before, even before that, we call the invasion of Taiwan become imminent, very important. They already have a lot of motion, have a lot of action in the South China Sea, especially in the Sprite Island. We built the island, and we built the island, we built the airfield, and there will have the port, and we will be able to maybe station the submarine. All this for what? Not for fish, not for natural gas or oil, because still it's hard to exploit it in this region is the ocean is just too deep. Not so deep to hide all the submarine, but it's still deep enough to not allow the mass or commercial exploitation of natural gas. So what's the reason that we have to make all these aggressive action in South China Sea? That's another picture, and the dragon to make angry all our neighbor that it will be useful for us. All this is the pictures. The only reason is military, because Hainan is one of the islands that we can shoot, we can launch the rocket with the satellite heavier. And why we needed the satellite heavier? It's not just for GPS, for telecommunication. No, it's for the reconnaissance. It's for the military use. So if you wanted the resolution higher, you need a big camera, big imagine satellite in the lower orbit. So we needed a place we can really launch this kind of satellite. And the place near the zero altitude is the best. We told to do because the how we call that, the gravity, it will be lower when we get into the middle of the Earth. You know, so that's the place we can really launch the military use satellite. So that's one of the reasons that we have to protect the South China Sea, because that's the place we have that. And because we didn't get China, or we didn't get Taiwan yet, so the nuclear submarine, the SSBN, is all coming out from the Hainan naval base. So that's the double role played by this island. And this island is just to face all this ocean, and this ocean have to be protected. And if we want to protect this ocean, Taiwan play a role, very important role in this place, because Taiwan is a flanking place. So both of them become necessary, and you want one, you need to have another. And so it's better to get all of them together. So if we still believe that there is a great power competition, then China will have no choice, according to their discourse. We will have no choice just to get Taiwan and expand our influence in the South China Sea. Otherwise, we will have no second strike capability. And if we don't have second strike capability, we will never become the superpower. It's just as simple as that. And if you say China don't want to be that, then ask Xi Jinping, don't ask me. But I think the answer is very clear. And that's all these military or strategic pictures show us why it's not so optimistic, in my point of view, that Taiwan can stand there and say, okay, we just say, okay, we want to reunify with you and we do nothing. No, you have no choice, and the time is not on your side, it's in China's side. So that's the conclusion that I will make, and this to make the underline that both things is together. We cannot separate them to South China Sea and East China Sea. They are all together, and all together in China's global great strategy and confronting with US global grand strategy. So it looks like everything lock in. There's no way to get out. I'm sorry to say that before the dinner, but that's the truth. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much to the three presenters, and I'm sure there will be lots of questions. Let me, while you think about your question, let me just get the ball rolling. And first, my first question would go to Mrs. Hashmi. India is a very interesting case in point because on one hand, it's a member of the BRICS, and on the other, as you said, it's now a more active participant in the in the Quad. Some people have speculated that, in fact, India remained neutral after the invasion of Ukraine by Russia because it gets arms supplies. But what if the US were to strike a bargain with India, whereabout it would supply it with arms to cut it off from Russia? In any case, after the war is over, Russia will have been weakened. Do you think in those circumstances that India may look more favorably at getting involved if there is a conflict that erupts over Taiwan?
I think it's a very good question, and the question that has been discussed widely. We have seen how India has been taking active participation in the quadrilateral dialogue. We saw 4 quadrilateral meetings, second in-person summit just now, but at the same time, India is also participating in BRICS, SCO, even RIC. So what India follows is, of course, the policy of strategic autonomy, what Drake also talked about. But I think more than that, what India's policy has been is that India follows multi-alignment, an issue-based coalition. If you look at the statements of Dr. Jaishankar, the Foreign Minister of India, you would realize that how India has been trying to manage tensions with China, but at the same time, it's also calling out China for its aggression in the Indo-Pacific towards India. So I think this is very important when we talk about India's position in the quadrilateral dialogue, as well as participation in the fora where China is an active part. So I think what India has been trying to do with China specifically is to keep the dialogue channel of communication open. So even after Galwan, that was the very first time that, so India-China border used to be called as one of the most peaceful disputed borders. So after 2020, that's not the case anymore. For the very first time, soldiers died on the Indian border with China. So I think this led to the change in perception. I won't say that this is a recent realization. I feel that since 1960s, India has been realizing, and time and again, that China doesn't want to resolve the boundary dispute. It wants to keep the dispute alive. But now the difference is what we're seeing, that this has been backed by the Chinese action as well, what India already knew about. And India also now realizing that China wants to change the status quo. It doesn't believe in the difference in perception of the LAC. So I think this is something that is a new development in India-China relationship. But when we talk about India's position on Ukraine, and as well as India-China relationship, how it has changed, Professor Messi actually asked me to talk about that as well in the email. I would say that the China-India standoff, the China-India differences is the reason, one of the major reasons what has actually driven India's position in Ukraine. If you look at it, now Russia has China. China is one country that has been very supportive of Russia. India, even though it hasn't really condemned Russia, but if you look at the statements, you would realize that India is somewhat condemning Russia, even if it has abstained at the UN. And I think it's China's position, India's position, totally different from each other when it comes to Ukraine. So I believe that the differences, India, as I mentioned also in my talk, that China is an existential threat to India as well. And if it doesn't really address the issue of the closeness of the marriage of convenience, that is Russia-China relationship that is famously characterized as the axis of convenience. So India doesn't want to, it's not in India's interest to see this relationship going forward and Russia going into China's arm entirely. So I think this is also one of the reasons, but eventually India is trying to diversifying its military supplies. It doesn't really want to be dependent on Russia entirely. But as you mentioned, that if at all US offers that kind of program to India, but I don't see that happening anytime soon. So this is also one of the major concerns within the Indian strategic community as well. But if it all happens, I think, and it should happen, because if you look at it, there's more alignment between India and the US now. and even India, Australia, India, Japan, not even at the quadrilateral level, even if you look at the bilateral level, India has such robust ties with all these three countries. So why not, but look at AUKUS. India is not really given an offer to be a part of AUKUS. Now that India is going to be a part of AUKUS, there are going to be a lot of discussion about that, but it hasn't been offered. So about your suggestion, I really don't think that's happening anytime soon.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Grossman, what would it take for the US Congress to agree to and be supportive of a US military intervention in Taiwan? Let's say that, you know, Dr. Lin, scenario works out that, and that some assets in the region, some US assets in the region are attacked. Would that be enough of a trigger?
Yeah, that's really hard to say. I think, well, first, what's important to consider is how does the average American feel about supporting Taiwan in a conflict scenario? And you know, it's interesting. The University of Chicago has done some excellent survey research over the last few years on exactly that question, and others as well. And what they found on the question of would the average American be supportive of the U.S. military intervening in a Taiwan scenario is that the percentage who say yes has actually been going up. And I believe the last time they polled it, which I think was last year, it was at about 60% yes. Now that's not, you know, an overwhelming majority of Americans, but it's more than 50%. So I think that is something to consider when, you know, the duly elected representatives in Congress are considering whether to support such an action. But I also think, you know, there's a fair amount that the executive branch in the United States can do without the legislative branch, whether that's, you know, constitutional or not, or good or bad. I'm not gonna jump down that rabbit hole, but I mean, indeed, you know, the White House has shown over many decades now that, you know, limited military operations are essentially allowable without congressional consent, without a formal declaration of war. In fact, the United States Congress has not declared war officially since World War II. And, you know, so take that for what it's worth. You know, and I think the Ukraine situation is also kind of, you know, when it comes to providing arms packages to Ukraine, those need to go through Congress. And the same would be true for Taiwan. And then, you know, obviously we're not deploying ground troops to Ukraine. In a Taiwan scenario, there might be a different sentiment about that. We may decide to do so. But like I said, you know, in the past, the executive branch has been given a pretty wide aperture to deploy troops in a fairly limited fashion, but nonetheless, it's happened. Now, I'd also point out that our Congress right now, as polarized as it is actually pretty much singing in unison on being pro-Taiwan and anti-China. It is bipartisan support, and even among, you know, the extremes in the Democratic and Republican parties. And so, you know, I think that Congress, my own general sense of it is that Congress would be supportive of doing more for the factors that I've outlined.
Thank you. I would add that in terms of economic relations, I think that Taiwan is the 12th economic partner of the U.S. and Ukraine is 87. So I would say that economically, the U.S. would have more at stake with Taiwan. Dr. Lin, very interesting presentation, and clearly it's a case of David against Goliath if China were to attack Taiwan. But let's recall that China has not fought a war since it invaded Vietnam, I think in 1978. And also that it gets 70% of its oil from abroad. Don't you think that if tensions increase, that maybe the first move by the US would be to organize a naval blockade to stop trade goods going to China?
But if you blockade China, which means you declare war to China, then where you will fight with China is everywhere you find the Chinese boat, you will have to attack. And at the same time, China will do the same. And then that's the Third World War. It's not that the Ukraine or Russia becomes Third World War, but it's for sure that if we blockade China, then there will be a Third World War. So China will, that's only also one of the reasons that China become close to Russia is for this reason too. Then if we blockade them at the sea, then they get the oil from Russia. So they can still hang on a little bit, but not so long, but they will have some supply from Russia. And then if they get involved into the war between China and the US, which means they will have only very few friends stand on the side of China, which means Russia. And Russia will be the only one who can support China. And then they'll have to calculate if we do want to invade Taiwan, it's for what political end. And that will determine the way, the means, the military means they will apply. If they want to get Taiwan and of course some place of the South China Sea for the great power status, then that will be different, which means we have to get them first, not to involve the conflict with all these middle power or superpower like US or European Union. What do we have as option? The only way can do that is very fast and all-out attack and force Taiwan to get into the table to negotiate. Mm-hmm. That is very possible because after all these 10 years with Ma Ying-jeou as president, Taiwan military force has already been reduced by themselves for 10 years. And that's the best moment. And now we are already, thanks to Ukraine war, Taiwan is really reconsidered to extend the service, the military service. And that will be the first step. If they start and then finish the build up to stand for at least 1, 2, 3 weeks, waiting for the other reinforcement or the international sanction against China, then it will be too late. So that's why I totally agree with Stephen about the dangers of the situation in the Strait, in the Taiwan Strait. We cannot just say, okay, it's no way because China is fragile. I think it's the other way around. It's because they have a lot of problems to solve. So why not solve them all together? And that will be the solution or the answer. We invade Taiwan, we solve everything. Including all those Tangping, the young men Tangping, we send them all to the military camp and everybody will stand up, will not lay down all together all the time. And I think that's not a normal for the party leaders thinking.
Thank you. Well, thank you. Let's open questions to the floor. Yes, at the back.
Yes, we have a question from Cleo Pascal, which is listening to us online. So for all the panelists, she says, if China settles the Taiwan question, either peacefully or otherwise, are the parts of India that China claims or just wants at greater risk?
So, yeah. Okay.
You know, this is a question that specifically has been asked on social media, and I'm saying social media because there's a lot of support for Taiwan on social media, but this is one question specifically whenever I tweet, there are a set of people who just say, but what about Taiwan's claim on Indian territory? I think what we have to really see here that KMT's approach and DPP's approach totally different. It's of course there in the constitution, and Taiwan has been very, very cautious, especially the DPP administration, while dealing with anything that's in the Constitution. And one example is the changes on the passport. It took them a lot of time to make Taiwan bigger and make Republic of China smaller on the passport. But they still couldn't change the name of the airlines. You talk about China Airlines, everyone thinks that it is the airline of China, state carrier of China, and not Taiwan. So there have been demands, there have been calls from the people to change the name and to highlight the identity of Taiwan more. Now coming to that question, I think tomorrow, we're talking about peaceful reunification, but when we talk about peaceful reunification, we also think about the will of the people. This is what Sang-Wan and DPP have been talking about it. That the fate of Taiwan will only be decided by the people of Taiwan. So even when we talk about claims on Indian territory, we have to talk about the fate of Taiwan. So I won't say that if Taiwan is peacefully reunified with China, then what is going to happen with the territory? But this is the question I think Taiwan really needs to talk about, but I think these are very sensitive issues to talk about right now, because there are still certain people in Taiwan, part of population that believes what KMT has been talking about, claims on Indian territory and how they are more Chinese than Taiwanese. So these are ideological issues that have been really discussed in Taiwan. If you look at the NCCU election survey, in Taiwan, every year they do it, you would realize that every year the percentage of people who identify themselves as just Taiwanese is increasing. So I think all these issues are interrelated, and we have to see all these issues in connection with how Taiwan is changing.
Would anyone else want to add?
Yeah, just one quick edit from what I said earlier. It was not the University of Chicago, it was the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. So my apologies for that, for the survey, for the surveys that they've been doing on the average American and what they think about Taiwan and other issues. So check that out. I would just add to what Sana said, so even if the Taiwan issue as it was framed, although I don't really like that framing in the question, but let's say the Taiwan issue goes away overnight, peacefully or otherwise, right? The PRC still has territorial claims in dispute with India, and that's not going, that has nothing really to do with Taiwan as far as I'm concerned. I mean, the PRC itself still claims places like Arunachal Pradesh and Aksai Chin, others, there's that land of actual control, or that line of actual control, that a boundary that's never fully been decided on either side. They both have a perception of what it should be, but China, for example, won't share an official map of where it thinks the LAC runs through. So that's really complicated how India's got to approach the situation. So I don't really see a connection, and I'm kind of wondering about the premise of the question. Thanks.
From my point of view, there will be a settlement, but there won't be a peaceful settlement, because we won't allow them to have a peaceful settlement. When we lose Taiwan, we lose the way to keep China down. And if we, for the reason of democracy, that we elect some Taiwanese become the continental, the mainlander, they just like Ma Ying-jeou, even worse. And they try to reunify with the political way with China. You think we will let them there for longer time enough? No. We didn't do that for the first time. We did that all the time. We did that in South Vietnam. We did that in South Korea in 1950. So he wants to stay there for a long time, which means there will be never a peaceful settlement. And China want to get back, we want to get back Taiwan and want to become or replace US, they have to get Taiwan. And if that's the ambition that Xi Jinping or the successor of Xi Jinping have, then there is the only way, is a war. The invasion of Taiwan is the only way to get Taiwan. Otherwise, there is no way. There's no peaceful settlement, and the Taiwanese don't want to get reunified with China. When I was in the army, when I was in the Marine Corps, what we think at the time. That's already 10 years after the reform. The Deng Xiaoping already declared we are a peaceful country, something like that. The only way we think is if it's not us, we unify China, there will be no unification. And we are a small piece of island. We think about that. What do you think China will think? There is no way that China will just give us, give Taiwan live there for a long time. And so then we can just eliminate this possibility. And you see, it's dangerous. So what we can do with that? How we can extend this eventual war as long as far as possible. That's what we have to do. And the only way that I think, maybe I am a little bit one-sided minded, but the only way that we can stop the war or the war immediately explodes is Taiwan have a very strong defense capability. And that is what they are doing right now. I'm too old to go back to retrain as a soldier, but I have done my job when I was young. So now it's their responsibility to do their job. And if they don't want to do that, then there will be still no more, there will still no peaceful settlement, but they will be invited. That's all.
If I may add something. I totally agree with Dr. Lin here. And specifically, there's not going to be any peaceful reunification, specifically after what has happened in Hong Kong. I think perception of people has changed drastically, especially after 2014, after the umbrella movement. I don't think most of the people in Taiwan, they're going to accept one country, two system in Taiwan. And specifically, how Taiwan has been projected as an alternative to a democratic China, be it pandemic, be it a democracy that gives full freedom to the people of Taiwan. So I think this is very important. How China has treated Hong Kong has played an important role in the change of perception among people in Taiwan.
Yep, very important. Are there questions from the floor? Yes?
I'm just wondering, you mentioned potential partners. There's a very important potential partner just to the south of Taiwan. Steve? Yes.
Thank you. The Philippines. They are to the south of Taiwan. Together they form the Luzon Strait, and U.S. does have a treaty with the Philippines. What do you think they're likely to, particularly after the presidential election, what do you think they are likely to react to some sort of Chinese demonstration against Taiwan?
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I didn't include the Philippines because, like you said, they are a formal ally of ours, along with Thailand and Southeast Asia. So they were kind of off to the side. But I'm glad you asked about them, because now that gives us the opportunity to talk about one or both. So with the Philippines, you know, they obviously had the election. So we've moved away from the most, in my view, the most anti-American and pro-Chinese Philippine president in history, Rodrigo Duterte. He steps down on June 30th, and then Ferdinand Marcos Jr., or Bongbong Marcos as he's called, the son of the former dictator, steps into Malacanang on the same day. And it's interesting because I think what we're going to see there, so just broadly about the alliance, I think what we're going to see there is certainly a new president of the Philippines who is going to value the U.S. alliance and not try to undo it as Duterte did. There's many examples of this, but I mean, most notably, Duterte terminated the Visiting Forces Agreement, which is really kind of the underpinning agreement of the Mutual Defense Treaty. It allows the U.S. military to more seamlessly enter and move around the Philippines for a variety of potential contingencies, to include dealing with China in the South China Sea, and perhaps a China-Taiwan scenario, although I think that's not really high on the Philippines' radar. But anyway, so we're moving from Duterte to now Marcos Jr. And Marcos Jr., he's made very limited statements about foreign policy. In fact, he refused to participate in most of the national debates during the campaign. He refused to give a robust number of interviews. So it's kind of hard to understand like what he's all about. But in the limited data that we have, it's pretty clear that he does value the alliance. And he plans to strengthen the alliance. He speaks glowingly about his father, and his father did exactly that. So I think he's going to try to walk in the shoes of his father for a while, at least on the U.S. alliance. And then on China, you know, he has said, and I think this is a very positive development, unlike Duterte, who for really until almost the end of Duterte's tenure, he refused to acknowledge the arbitration agreement in the Philippines' favor in 2016 over China. And it was really, you know, Duterte came into office in 2016. It was 4 years. In July 2020, his government finally acknowledged it. Whereas Bongbong has essentially said, no, that we won that arbitration and we're going to stick with it. And, you know, we're going to make sure that the Philippines' territorial integrity and sovereignty within the South China Sea is defended. Now, how are they going to do that? I mean, you know, that's going to be more difficult. The thing that worries folks about Bongbong is that his family, including he himself, have longstanding ties to the Chinese Communist Party, mostly financial ties. The Chinese embassy in the Philippines called him a friend, a good friend. So, you know, I mean, it's unclear how that's all going to work out in terms of intensifying great power competition between the US and China over the Philippines. When it comes to Taiwan specifically, I mean, he has not made any statements about that. And it's really, and he's not even president yet, technically, right? June 30th is when the transition will occur. So, you know, I would be stunned. I mean, I guess pleasantly stunned if he said something about, you know, the Philippines has growing concern about what's going on in the Taiwan Strait. His predecessor certainly did not. So, yeah.
There is one question at the back, and then we'll come to Charles in the front.
So Remy Corgetti here. I'm a graduate student at Laval University. And I'd like to come back to the concept of integrated deterrence that was mentioned in the previous panel. So we know that concept of integrated deterrence intends to create a synergy between the different facets of American power, and also to decentralize deterrence a lot more to allies and partners. And Mr. Grossman said that there is not much to be expected from partners in the case of a Taiwan contingency. However, Washington seems to be expecting something from partners. And I was wondering, how do ASEAN countries fit in the US integrated deterrence concept? So that's for Mr. Grossman. Then I have another question for Dr. Hashmi. So let's say there is a hot war between Taiwan and China. Is it conceivable for India to deploy forces en masse near the contested territories at the Chinese border in order to pin down Chinese forces there so they are not mobilized over a Taiwan contingency? Would that be conceivable? So that's it for me. Thank you.
But if you ask me, as I also mentioned in the talk, if the situation remains somewhat what it is today, I don't think India is going to deploy its forces just because of the Taiwan contingency. But I think we have to see how we are seeing that there's much more alignment, much more synergy between India and the US and other partners. So I think we have to wait and see how this relationship pans out later. But India has its own problem to deal with when it comes to China. And being close to an aggressive country with hegemonic tendencies and fighting a border dispute for the past 70 years. I don't think that's actually fair on other countries' part to expect from India. But I think, as I said, we just have to wait and see, and the onus actually lies on the US. The US can't just talk about, Biden just can't go and say that we have a commitment to defend Taiwan. And I think we are asking the wrong question today. Is war coming? But I think what we have to really talk about is how to stop the war. And if India is important for the quadrilateral security dialogue, if Quad can't go ahead without India, and India is an important counterweight to China in the region, so how can we even envisage an effective response to Taiwan contingency without India?
Yeah, no, thanks for the question on integrated deterrence. I think yeah, the Biden administration has talked somewhat about integrated deterrence, but I don't think at this point it's all too clear what they mean when they mention it. What it seems like, to be honest, is statecraft, using all levers at your disposal, diplomatic, economic, military, and whatever else, right, to convince an adversary or potential adversary to not take a certain action. Okay, so you know, we've thought a lot about this at RAND, and you know, at RAND, one of the things that we talk a lot about is the difference between deterrence by denial versus deterrence by punishment. And in the Ukraine situation, it's clear that deterrence by denial is not what the Biden administration had in mind, because Russia invaded, and there was no deterrent value that we could put forward to deny Russia what it was about to do to Ukraine. But we are engaged, we the United States are engaged in deterrence by punishment at this point through sanctions. Now, the Biden administration will tell you that it's been overwhelmingly successful. We've united Europe, we've united NATO, right? But outside of Europe, I think it's actually been kind of a failure, to be honest. I mean, you have India, which is the world's largest democracy, not taking a side. You have many countries, pretty much every country within to get to your point about ASEAN, Southeast Asia, right? Singapore is the only one out of 10 ASEAN countries to sign up to Western-led sanctions, 1 out of 10, okay? In the rest of the Indo-Pacific, you have the usual suspects, Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, and Australia, and New Zealand, who are helping, right? But nobody else, okay? In the rest of the developing world, I mean, it's hard to find a single country. Actually, there are no other countries in the developing world that have signed up to Western-led sanctions. So in my view, deterrence by punishment has not worked out well. Now, Taiwan's gonna be different, because if China were to threaten to invade Taiwan, I think integrated deterrence in that sense is gonna be deterrence by denial. We are clearly setting the groundwork by providing Taiwan with asymmetrical defenses, and that, you know, that we talked about on this panel, right? To, you know, basically convince Beijing it's not worth it. And we also have Japan and Australia now making statements about how, you know, they are increasingly concerned, even South Korea, right? And New Zealand just this week, everyone is increasingly concerned about the need to maintain peace and stability in the Taiwan Strait, because it is not going in that direction. So the implication for Beijing, again, from a deterrence by denial standpoint, should be, if you were to invade or otherwise attack Taiwan, you're not just going to deal with the US, you're going to deal with other friends of the US as well. And that is, you know, it's unwinnable for you, right? So that's where I think there's kind of this difference. But integrated deterrence, it's, you know, if deterrence by denial doesn't work, then deterrence by punishment is clearly, at least if it's happening under the Biden administration, is clearly what they would turn to next.
Charles?
It's interesting that ASEAN came up in a brief phrase at the start, and then you've referred to it now. I just wonder, is ASEAN in this Taiwan context pretty much irrelevant, both to China and to the United States? I think I know the answer to that, but in a broader context, in the geopolitical struggle to which the panelists have alluded, is ASEAN an important organization, both for the States and for China? It seems to be certainly for China, but interested in your comments.
You're looking at me, I presume? Okay.
I look at all of you.
Okay. All right, well, I'll just say that, you know, ASEAN members themselves will tell you that since the establishment of our organization, we have prevented war in what was previously a war-torn region. And we've prevented war for generations, right? So ASEAN works. And I think it's debatable whether there's causation there. Because there's ASEAN, there's no war. I don't know that I can draw that causal link. Maybe it's true, but it's unclear to me whether it exists. When outside powers look at ASEAN, I mean, it's pretty clear that they don't think ASEAN is carrying its weight. I don't think that there would be a Quad if ASEAN did things that the Quad members wanted them to do. I don't think there would be an AUKUS if the AUKUS members thought ASEAN was doing what they should be doing against China. And so it's a little rich, you know, for Quad members to meet up and reaffirm ASEAN centrality. They always do that, reaffirm ASEAN centrality within the Indo-Pacific, and yet they're doing things that don't involve ASEAN, right? And I think the ASEAN members kind of, you know, are peeved about that, and they're worried about it too, because they're worried about losing their centrality and that everything the Quad and AUKUS is saying is all just lip service, but they're also worried about extra regional countries meddling within their region once again. And, you know, for China, I think China views ASEAN, see, China likes to do everything bilaterally. That's their preference, okay? But ever since China was let in the door as an ASEAN +3 member, you know, they've actually quite used it to their advantage because they've been able to kind of play countries off each other. There was a slide that went up, I think, John, you had it, about the diversity within ASEAN, geographic diversity and you know, all kinds of things like that. And you know, when dealing with the South China Sea, if you are Thailand or Laos or Cambodia, I mean, Myanmar especially, I mean, you couldn't care less about the South China Sea. But if you're the Philippines, if you're Vietnam, Brunei, Indonesia, right? I mean, then you care. Malaysia, then you care a lot. So China is able to kind of play countries off each other. And that's why I think we have seen over the last few years, I mean, how long has the Code of Conduct negotiations been going on? Over 25 years now, okay? Depending on when you start the clock, but I think it's over 25 years. China has been consistently trying to water down the language of that Code of Conduct. And they do it by having Laos and Cambodia, Myanmar, support their position over others. And we're seeing that right now with Cambodia as the chair of ASEAN for this year. You're not going to get a strong South China Sea statement this year from ASEAN. Next year, it'll be Indonesia. But guess what? China and Indonesia, since they had a standoff in late 2019, early 2020 over fishing in the Natunyas, have actually bounced back in their relationship through things like BRI and pandemic recovery. And Indonesia is actually feeling pretty good about China. So I wonder if it might be the same type of thing, even though the Natunya Sea is at the southernmost, is just south of the southernmost dash of the 9-dash line. And they have even though Indonesia is an unofficial maritime counterclaimant to the South China Sea, there still is tension there, but the relationship has bounced back. So China likes to do things bilaterally and play them off each other. And so I don't think ASEAN has a good response to it.
I want to add to this. I think ASEAN being divided on China is both a strength and weakness for ASEAN. And I think ASEAN is very much relevant, not just for itself. And if you look at all the Indo-Pacific approaches by countries, you would realize that ASEAN centrality is at the core of several countries' Indo-Pacific approach. I believe that this division within ASEAN has made it into an organization that's not entirely pro-China. As Derek mentioned, there's some countries are pro-China, some countries have more dependence on China than the others. I believe that it hasn't turned into something what the SCO has become. Now, India is a part of SCO, it's different. Now, if you look at the statement of the SCO, all the countries except India, they endorse one China policy. They talk about Xinjiang, Tibet, even Taiwan. When India joined SCO, there was a statement that came that all the countries of the SCO except India endorsed the Belt and Road Initiative. So all these countries are very pro-China, of course, because of the geography. But when we talk about organization, I think if we have to talk about organization in the region, ASEAN is very much relevant and different from other organizations where China is active. And apart from just, in addition to what ASEAN is for the Southeast Asian countries, I think for decades, ASEAN has provided a neutral ground to countries to come and talk. For example, the Quad senior official level meeting happened on the sidelines of the ASEAN meetings. So I think this is also where ASEAN is very, very relevant for countries. And then be it East Asia Summit, ARF, ADMM+, it gives a platform for other countries to come and talk about defense and security issues. So I think this is also where ASEAN is relevant.
Are there other questions from the audience or from people online? No. Well, I think in that case, we have come to the conclusion of this panel. And thank you very much to all the panelists. I'll leave the last word to Dr. Messi.
Thank you very much, Mr. St-Jacques, for chairing this last panel today. And thank you very much to all to have attended this conference that I very much appreciated today. I just wanted to take a few minutes in my concluding remarks. I wanted to draw a synthesis of what's been discussed today, in part for Remy, who will be writing a report in the end of this conference that we'll publish on the Network for Strategic Analysis website, summarizing the discussions we've had and perhaps the debates also. And I have to say that you did not make my job easy to synthesize it, because I was going to start with Jonathan's formula of, well, is war over China coming? Well, it's unlikely but possible. But then as the day grew, you became more and more pessimistic about its likeliness. And so I think that the formula I would use is that we are currently in an acute security dilemma, that's for sure, that could spiral into an all-out war, but that there are certain factors that we need to consider that may prevent that from happening. There are not that many. Some have mentioned a huge economic cost this morning, especially by Bonnie Glaser. That was mostly optimistic in that view, that liberal view, I would say. But most other trends seem to drive towards the inevitability of a conflict. With this small caveat, and I'll end with that question that you raised this afternoon, Sana, saying we're not asking the right question. We should be asking the question, how can we prevent that from happening? And on that question, I think that there's a greater consensus in the discussion today about the need for deterrence by denial, mostly. Something that has failed, of course, in Ukraine, and this is why there's war currently, with the decision of not defending that country, and the 2008 decision not to also offer membership to NATO to Ukraine. And I agree that we're not in that situation regarding Taiwan. It's not a full ally to the United States, but it's still much closer than what Ukraine was a couple of months ago, a couple of weeks ago. And however, if we look at, besides the United States, other countries' participation in that strategy of deterrence by denial, we see little, I think, being offered on the table in terms of capacity building, intelligence cooperation, maybe a little bit more, naval exercise, but it's still not, I would say, enough to really have assurance that it would deter a war. Perhaps there are other capacity building efforts that could be made, perhaps more pressures on Taiwan itself to increase its defense budget. I understand that Japan, from your presentation, Steve, that would mostly jump in any sort of coercion use of force by China. But even the numbers that you've shown in terms of defense budget are still very minimal if you think of the relative importance of the threat for Japan. So I'm prudently optimistic or pessimistic. I'm not sure exactly how I fit. I know that last time we were in a security dilemma, it ended up in a war in Europe. And I'm not completely sure that we can prevent it, but at least if we can mobilize a discussion in each of the countries that we come from, that perhaps one of the best way to prevent it is to increase our knowledge, increase our interest, and put some pressure in national governments to increase their participation in a perhaps integrated deterrence, but I would say deterrence by denial, I think would have more chances of succeeding. And I'll end by of course, thanking every one of you for taking part of this conference. But I want to do a special thank you to the 4 students that are making this conference possible. Of course, we're continuing the conference tomorrow, but I want to take a few minutes just to thank you. I want to thank Emile for live tweeting today throughout the entire conference. I want to thank Camille for monitoring the Q&A and the overall webinar on Zoom. I want to thank Remy for taking notes for the report that we'll be publishing at the end of the conference. And most notably, I want to thank Maxine, who has organized actually all of this. I haven't done much. He's been coordinating everything with you guys, and I want to thank you. And please join me in thanking all of these people for making this happening.